Today let us begin with chapter 7, part 2, chapter 7 of Gulliver's Travels. As I was telling you before also that this is a chapter, this is the most important chapter because the author's love of his country is being reflected, but through this love, what we find? We find that the quality of satire is increasing. How? বিকজ এই যে ক্যারেক্টারটা রয়েছে, এই যে লাইফস্টাইল বা এই যে বিলিফ সিস্টেমটা রয়েছে গালিভারের মধ্যে, this belief system is a reflection of most of the people who believe that Europe is best or England is best, and they are blinded by what? They are blinded by the principles of that country. Okay, and it is very alarming because a country which keeps on fighting, a country which keeps on destroying other countries or conquering other countries is very much applicable to its citizens. Okay, so what we find here is that through the proposal that or the proposal of giving a secret knowledge to the king, what we actually find out? We find out that this person is actually presenting the loopholes of the country's policies, loopholes of country's civilization. Okay, to the civilization, his words of love for his country is actually reflecting the shallowness of his own country. Okay, though he is saying that Brobdingnag, the king of Brobdingnag, has shallow mentality or narrow mentality or narrowness in thinking, but unfortunately what we find, it is the king of Brobdingnag who has high stakes of morality. Okay, morality stakes gulo hocche beshi high, and for any people who is living here, it is very very important. Okay, so Gulliver continued to support his country, its governance and institutions, and by doing so he is actually trying to present his country is the best. But unfortunately what we get to see that the readers with occasional inquisitiveness would understand that this is actually a very alarming situation where this kind of hyper nationalistic idea where you try to present your country is best, and your best ability is what? Your best ability is inventing the gunpowder. Okay, that kind of hyper national attitude which is stricken with violence, which is immersed in violence, is very alarming for humankind, and that is why it is a satire. Okay, so he artfully eluded many of the questions that were made because the prince was very curious and inquisitive about the things that were being said. And also what we find here is that he got a favorable turn of explaining certain things. Okay, the virtues and the beauties and the most advantageous light of England and also Europe. Okay, so what we find here is that he actually focuses on offering a secret information. What is the secret information? Secret information of the gunpowder. Okay, but the king was disapproving and even contemptuous of all this. Okay, so what we find here is that this would have miserable effects to this. Okay, miserable effects of this inventing gunpowder or bringing down gunpowder to this part of the world. Okay, to the world which does not know about it. He is saying that this gunpowder, he is describing how the gunpowder is made and how it is used. It is very strong. It can bring down walls to the ground and everything. It can destroy whole ranks of army at once. Okay, so he is describing, then you have to put the gunpowder in a tube, you have to put in a ball, as and if it is lighted, the iron or lead ball, and it actually can destroy thousands of people at one go. Okay, the largest ball does this discharge, it can bring down forts. Okay, so it can tear down houses to pieces, and the splinters that were spreaded throughout, it can actually dash the brains of all who came near it. Okay, so what we find here is that he is compounding all the violence stricken elements all together. Okay, he could directly focus on the violence over here, and he is projecting it as the best invention of the time. Okay, he is presenting it as the best invention of the time. Why? Because this gives him an immense superiority, a feeling of superiority, that he can destroy the army. He has the power to destroy so many things. Not just he, but his country. Okay, so what we find here is that this kind of attitude is actually alarming. Okay, where you get to see or you get to feel that you have power. Why? Because you can destroy certain things. Okay, but is it not true that you are more powerful when you are able to create more things? তুমি হচ্ছে এখানটা ডিস্ট্রয় করতে পারছো বলে তুমি তোমার নিজেকে পাওয়ারফুল বলে মনে করছো, কিন্তু পাওয়ারফুল কাকে বলে? পাওয়ারফুল হওয়া কাকে বলে? যে ডিস্ট্রয় করছে নাকি যে হচ্ছে কোনো কিছু ক্রিয়েট করছে? অবভিয়াসলি যে ক্রিয়েট করতে পারছে, কারণ the process of creation is much more effective. Okay, it is much more effective because this brings in a sense of liveliness. Okay, this brings in a sense of helpfulness. Okay, but what we find here is that this life and that Gulliver is presenting is very, very alarming, in the sense that it shows the deteriorated condition of human beings. Okay, what we see that this kind of destructive attitude makes the king awestruck. Okay, the king was struck with horror at this description. Okay, and this the description that Gulliver has given of those terrible engines, and the proposal that he made that he can bring this so that the king can control everything and all these things. But what we find here is that the king was not much interested. Okay, he was amazed how so important and groveling an insect that Gulliver is, because if you remember that Gulliver is in the size of what? Gulliver is the size of a Lilliput. Okay, even lower than Lilliput. Right, so in front of these giant like people, in front of these giant human beings, if you say so, what is Gulliver? Gulliver is nothing. He could be squashed in a bit. But this insect looking thing, and these things have so violence in them that actually struck the king. Okay, and what we find here is that, as I said before also, this violence that they entertained were actually presented, the violence that they entertained was actually entertained by the humans, but these actions are actually inhuman. Okay, these ideas are inhuman and in so familiar in a manner as to appear wholly unmoved at all the scenes of blood and desolation. Okay, and what Gulliver had painted as the common effects of the destructive machines were foresaid, and those were some evil geniuses, enemy to mankind. Okay, as for himself, he protested that although few things delighted him so much as the new discoveries of art or in nature, yet he would rather lose half his kingdom than be privy to such a secret of gunpowder. Okay, which he commended Gulliver, as Gulliver valued his life never to mention anymore. Okay, so what we find here is that we have heard that with great powers come great responsibilities, right? In Spider-Man movies, right? So what we find here is that this is the kind of responsibility that a king should have. Okay, the king, if he could have brought gunpowder or the use the secret of gunpowder, he could have ruled over and over years. Okay, he could have destroyed all his armies throughout, right? But what we find here is that he is not using that. He is moralistic. He believes in saving the lives of people. He does not believe in controlling people's lives. Unlike several leaders who, after getting to power, they do not focus on the betterment of the people. Right. So what I find here is that here is the contrast. Here is the contrast. People who consider them to be human beings, who consider themselves to be the greatest of human beings, they are Lilliput over here. That is the people of England. Gulliver is a representative of them. He is nothing over here, but he is filled with this venomous attitude. Okay, and this violence stricken attitude which actually destroys everything, which can actually destroy everything. What Gulliver believes that? Gulliver believes that the king is enclosed with what? Enclosed with narrow principles and short views. He does not have the idea of farsightedness, but he is wrong. Okay, so the prince possesses every quality of procreous veneration, love, and esteem, of strong parts, great wisdom, and profound learning, endued with admirable talents for the government, and almost adored by his subjects, should form a nice, unnecessary scruple, whereof in Europe we have no conception. Okay, so what we find here is that this presents that neither do Gulliver say this as the least intention to detract from the many virtues of the excellent king, whose character Gulliver has already described as a person who with sensible will and account. But what he takes over here is a defect among them, is the reason from their ignorance. Okay, he is considering them to be ignorant about the hitherto reduced politics into science and everything. Okay, so which is more acute wits of Europe had done. For Gulliver remember very well in a discourse one day with the king, when Gulliver happened to say there were several thousand books uh, among the human beings, written upon the art of government and everything, it gave him, direct contrary to his intention, a very mean opinion of the understanding. Okay, he professed both to abominate and despise all mystery, refinement, and intrigue, either in a prince or a minister. He could not tell what I meant by secret of state, where an enemy or some rival nation were not in case. Okay, he confined knowledge governing with a very narrow bounds and everything. So what we find over here, um this imperfection, this imperfection is not just one of organization or law. Okay, this imperfection that is present between Gulliver and um, the king is presented fundamentally of the morals. Okay, the morality or the fundamentals of morals are different between these two peoples. Okay, the imperfection that the British and the extension of humanity in general are not only bad at getting what they want, they also want bad things. Okay, have you understood? So what we find here is that this is the truth. This truth is illustrated in Gulliver's offer of the secret of the gunpowder to the king. Okay, he is describing all these things, that they are not just getting bad at everything, but they are always wanting bad things for other people also. They are continuously focusing on what? They are continuously focusing on destroying. Though the king refuses without a second thought, what we find, not because the Brobdingnagians have superior technology, but because he is horrified by the potential moral and psychological consequence of the gunpowder. Okay, gunpowder can easily destroy everything. That is the physical consequence. But moreover, as I said, with great power comes great responsibility. But unfortunately, most people do not understand that. Okay, when one gets greater amount of power, what they do? They use that to dominate others. Okay, so once gunpowder is available in this place, once gunpowder is easily available in this kingdom, the people who will hold that will get superior power, and they might even degrade their morality. By what? By destroying the people at their own wish. Okay, so the consequence is not just physical destruction. Physical destruction is the least, where buildings will be collapsing, people could easily be brought to death, they could be killed. But the moral degradation is of most focus. Okay, so most people, most pre-industrial societies would treat gunpowder as an achievement of highest order. Okay, where it easily controls the army, or it easily destroys armies of opposing parties. But the king of this place indicates that he feels it would be better to live where violence and destruction are minimized instead of exaggerated. And he is quite right in saying so. So, by placing Gulliver in opposition to the king, by placing the ideas of Gulliver, the ideas of England which he represents, in front of the king, what we find? We actually find how petty the ideas of Europe are, how petty the ideas of England is. Okay, so what we find here is that this is the idea which is being propagated throughout the world. Okay, you can see in several other countries, even our country, we tend to spend more on military budget in we spend to uh, we tend to the in not we the government tend to spend more on defense than health sector. Okay, so what we find here is that this is actually violence stricken. This is actually the case which the king needs to avoid, and he is avoiding that. He indicates that for living you should focus on removing the violence. Okay, you should minimize the violence instead of exaggerating it. Okay, if you are controlling people uh, based on your power to destroy you will not be loved, but you will be hated. Okay, you will be hated more and more. You will be feared till the point you are in power. Clear? Gulliver's inability to understand the king's position, he sees the refusal as a weakness in the king's understanding. He says that his mind is narrow, he is not open to new ideas and everything. But what we find here is that actually the mindset of these people are huge. Okay, they do not want their people to be destroyed. The king does not want to control his kingdom through hatred, because he knows the implications. If he brings that thing, it will percolate generation after generation. একবার যদি হচ্ছে পার্কুলেটেড হয়, একবার যদি এই ডিজিজ অফ ভায়োলেন্সটা পার্কুলেটেড হয়, সেটা যুগ যুগ ধরে জেনারেশনের পর জেনারেশন ছড়াতে থাকবে। ওকে, তার জন্যই সে কি করছে, তার জন্যই সে এটাকে ইনকর্পোরেট করতে চাইছে না। ওকে, what we see that it is the general tradition of people to consider human beings who do not apply violence to be weak. Okay, we do generally consider human beings to be weak if he is not using violence, or even after knowing the application of violence he is avoiding that. We generally tend to do that, we generally tend to use that sense. But here the king is much more far-sighted. He is not using this power, or he is not taking the secret of gunpowder from Gulliver, because he knows that what it will happen. Okay, he believes that this kind of inclusion, this kind of violence inclusion will actually destroy the morality of the society. Okay, so Gulliver's inability is actually showcasing the inability of the European society, the inability of the British people, that this country can also be ruled by what? It can be also be ruled by love. Okay, so he focuses or he says that those are inhuman ideas. The king says that those are inhuman ideas, but when Gulliver Gulliver says that this is the idea of the king. This idea of the king is actually narrow-mindedness. Okay, so what we find here is that when he says that, when he mentions that this is the inability, or it is the king's inability, what it actually illustrates how the values of violent society are deeply ingrained in Gulliver. Okay, these values of a violent society is deeply ingrained in Gulliver because of his upbringing in a society which is always violence stricken. The history of England will always have the history of wars. Does have the history of wars. It has the history of dominating one country with another, and not just of England, but also of Europe. The history of Europe is the history of violence, and this violence is ingrained within Gulliver. And Swift is actually critiquing, is satirizing this political violence that has been ingrained with every notion within every human being. Okay, so what we find here is that this violent stricken society is very uh, harmful for the growth of a peaceful nation. Okay, nevertheless, the Brobdingnagians are not perfect, however, much more developed in moral sense maybe than Gulliver's or the European standards. They are rather humans who have achieved a gargantuan level of moral achievement. Okay, they have a huge amount of moral achievement, but unfortunately, we do not focus on the morals of one person. We actually focus on what monetary policy they have, what military policy they have of a country, and this is quite demeaning, this is quite alarming for a generation, because if we focus on violence, if we keep on focusing on violence, there will never be end of any war. Okay, uh, unlike the petty and minuscule Lilliputians, in whom the human vices and pride and self-righteousness and exaggeration are present, and those qualities, the human vices of pride and self-righteousness, are exaggerated in the Lilliputians. The Brobdingnagians have constructed a society in which those vices, the human vices, are minimized, okay, as much as possible. Though it is there, you can see in the clown or the dwarf's actions, he is after terrorizing Gulliver. It has not been destroyed completely, but it is minimized. Okay, so they are large at heart, they are large in size, but what we find here is that they do not have that quality of undermining, demeaning others. Okay, they obviously act in order to get benefit for themselves, like the farmer. He only acted, or he only used Gulliver for his own benefit, but at the same time his daughter was there to take care of Gulliver. So both things are simultaneously presented over here. Whereas in Lilliputians, they are of so small a size, right? They are so small, but what we find, they are the vicious race that you can see. They are always talking about violence. They are always talking about treaties. Okay, this still exists. For instance, the farmer exploits the Gulliver, as I said, by showing him for profit, but they are not as they are in England, encoded in the structure of government itself. Okay, so what we find here is that this style, this masculine attitude of the European people, so-called masculine attitude, if you say so, the violence-stricken attitude is not present over here. In spite of their large size, they do not treat the weakness of humankind. Okay, they do not focus on harming others, whereas the European moralist or Europeans lack the moral tradition in them. Okay, to conclude, we can say the Brobdingnagians are more moral than the Lilliputs, more practical than the Laputans of the third voyage, if you read the third part, and more human than the Houyhnhnms, that is of the fourth voyage. Okay, and these Brobdingnagians are in some ways most admirable of the society, or every society that Gulliver encounters. Why? Because in today's world, morality is the thing which lacks. Everyone is after destroying other. Everyone is filled with violence in whatever form it might be. Everyone is filled with violence in order to control the other, in order to destroy the other, in order to exert their own power in their own right. সে নিজে যে সুপিরিয়র সেটাকে বোঝানোর চেষ্টা। But when it comes from a king, that he refuses the most powerful way to control a society, most powerful way to destroy his enemies, he is refusing that. This shows the moral character of the king, and he is not just doing it for himself or his government. What he is doing it for? He is doing it for the generations to come. Okay, he is protecting the generations' morality. Okay, and not his own generation, but future generations also, and that is the most important thing. It depends on the stance, it depends on the actions taken by the supreme leader, which actually helps the country to choose the right path. Okay, if the supreme leader is deluded, if the supreme leader is biased towards one community or one country or any other, what will actually happen? He will actually propagate violence, he will actually propagate hatred among others, which should not be done. Okay, once you are in power, you should be neutral, you should be able to do justice for human beings. But after saying so, what we find that most people consider their idea to be right. Okay, their idea to be right in saying that what they are doing is actually right for the betterment of the country. They do not think it in a neutral way, they are always biased. But for here, the king is filled with the sense of morality, and he is thinking for the betterment of the country, and for him it is not important to hold on to the kingdom. He can give away his part of his kingdom, but he will not allow violence of that sort in his country, in his kingdom. Okay, and that is what is commendable, and that is what is needed in these times. It was needed in Swift's time, it was needed before that, and it is much more needed, much more important in today's time, where the country, where the world is fragmented, where the world is, when one country is against another. Okay, so it is very important to have a king like this, who will grow in a way to develop the country, not through violence, but through love, through morality. Even if he is tempted with supreme power of violence, he will not focus on that. He will focus on the betterment, the future betterment of his kingdom, of his countrymen. Okay, and that is what is needed in today's times also, and that is why Gulliver's Travel is read today also. Clear?